This Torah class is brought to you by TorahAnytime.com.
Boa noite. Temos a honra de receber aqui em São Paulo o Rabino Rabbi Glatstein, um dos grandes oradores, talvez um dos maiores oradores da língua inglesa hoje em dia, o Rabino que mais tem Shiurim em Torah Anytime, viaja pelo mundo inteiro, um grande conhecimento. Para o Brasil é uma grande honra, então vamos aproveitar para agradecer primeiramente os Rabanim da Keilat Beit Yaakov, que está com a gente aqui o Rabino Cohen, a diretoria da Beit Yaakov, o Yom Shekolot Torah, que proporcionaram isso para toda a comunidade de São Paulo. Então vamos escutar o Rav, por favor.
Good evening, everyone. It's a great honor to be here tonight. I'm so overjoyed to be in this Kehila Kedosha, in this historic community, Beit Yaakov. Bershut Rabbanim, thank you, Rabbi Shammah, for the wonderful introduction. Bershut all the Rabbanim, Rav Kohen, and all the Rabbanim of Beit Yaakov, and all the Mishpachot that brought me here to this beautiful Kehila. All of our learning this evening and throughout my trip should be L'Zechut Rivka Bat Victoria Leah L'Bracha V'Hatzlacha. One of the most prolific educators of our time, a very multifaceted individual. He's a historian, he's a writer, he was a Rav, a Rosh Yeshiva, a columnist, someone who literally influenced the lives of thousands of people in many venues, Rabbi Berelwein. And when he made Aliyah, he did something that Americans are very afraid to do. I'm certainly afraid to do this. He decided to get an Israeli driver's license. Americans are very scared to drive in Israel, as they should be. And he took the driving test, and technically the tester is not supposed to tell the driver what the tester thinks of the driver's skills. They're just supposed to say pass or fail without any comment. But this particular tester tells Rabbi Wein, Rabbi, you're a good driver. So Rabbi Wein says, really, that's so interesting. What was it about my driving that impressed you? And the tester said, look, Rabbi, you did something that almost nobody does. Before you pulled out of your parking spot, you looked in your rear view mirror. Nobody does that. Most people just pull right out, and you looked out of your rear view mirror. Dear friends, this is one of the major problems in contemporary society. Nobody ever looks out of the rear view mirror of Jewish history. We tend to think, Jewish life began 30, 40, 50 years ago, and we plot the course of the rest of our life without looking back and studying where we came from. However, this often has disastrous consequences because we can only proceed carefully with our lives if we could clearly see out of the rear view mirror, because only if we understand where we came from and what transpired and what we've endured can we plot the course of our lives successfully. I would like to share with you a thought. This is a thought that burns very strongly in my soul. I would like to take you back about 80 years ago to 1946. The first Yom Kippur after the war, the first Yom Kippur after the Holocaust. They had just finished Kriyas HaTorah in a DP camp called Feldafink, which was a gathering of many of the broken shells, survivors of the terrible catastrophe, who were groping to put back the shattered pieces of their life together again. They had just finished Kriyas HaTorah on the holiest day of the year, on Yom Kippur. And on that day, General Eisenhower, Dwight Eisenhower, the supreme commander of the Allied forces, who later became the 34th President of the United States of America. Did you ever hear of the United States? Yeah, the United States is a little dot on the map north of Brazil. The United States of America, Dwight Eisenhower, who is the supreme commander of the Allied forces, he was going to come to this DP camp. And the word went out that when Eisenhower comes to the camp, they would have to appoint a representative to greet him, to give a speech, maybe a few speeches. And the representative needed to describe to Eisenhower the feelings of the survivor, to be able to capture in words the vent up, the pent feelings of the survivors. And there was a big dispute that arose in the camps. Who should this representative be? The Shomrei Torah mitzvahs in the camp said, there is no one who could represent us better than the Closenberg Rebbe, Zecher Tzaddik Livracha. Although he lost his wife and 11 children, he was the one who would go from one broken soul to the next, breathing life into the embers, reigniting the sparks of Yahadus, to be able to stir again the sparks of Judaism in people's souls. Who could better represent us than the Closenberg Rebbe? He has the heart. He's the father of the orphans, the father of the widows in the camps. And the more progressive ones, the more enlightened ones, the ones who had abandoned Torah and mitzvos, they said, a rabbi with a long beard? We forgot about that kind of Judaism. That kind of Judaism is an embarrassment to us. We buried that. We don't want to have anybody who looks that way. We want to have someone who could speak to the president, a man of today, not a man of the past, someone we don't have to be ashamed of. And a big argument broke out. Who will represent the survivors in this displaced person camp? And they came to a compromise. The compromise was, the Rebbe will speak, but the Rebbe will speak first. And number one, he has to be short. Number two, he can't mention the name of God. And number three, he cannot give musar. And after he speaks, the progressive camp said, we're going to appoint our own representatives and we'll have the final word. So Eisenhower came and they set up a big platform, a big stage. I actually have a picture of the stage of when Eisenhower came. And the Closenberg Rebbe went up to the podium to greet Eisenhower. And as the Closenberg Rebbe is coming to the podium, he grabbed a talis. And just as he's about to take the shtender, the Closenberg Rebbe makes a bracha, Baruch Ata Hashem Elokeinu Melech Haolam Asher Kiddushanu B'mitzvaysav V'tzivanu Lehisatev B'tzitzit. Everyone said Amen. And the Rebbe managed to get in the name of God. Then he greeted the general, and he thanked the general. And he said, we will forever be grateful to you for the part that you played, saving the lives of the remnant of a nation innocent of any crime, who was hounded and persecuted. We are forever grateful to you. And then he turns to the survivors. And there were thousands and thousands of survivors in the room. And he said, my dear brothers and sisters, we must never forget we are the nation of God. We must never forget that we have a purpose in this world. And if God selected us and chose us, and we survived, then we have a mission in this world. We have a tachlis in this world to sanctify the name of Hashem wherever we go. If God saved us and we survived, it was for a purpose. And as the Rebbe is talking, he's literally pulling on the heartstrings of all of these broken survivors. And the people began to cry. They hadn't cried in years. The survivors said they stopped crying 6 years ago. The well springs of tears had long dried up. And all of a sudden, tears, rivers of tears are flowing through the crowd. And Eisenhower never saw anything like this in his life. He's literally shaken to the core. He's profoundly moved. And after the Rebbe finished his short speech, they turned to the progressive camp and they say, okay, would anybody else like to speak? And they say, no, we left our papers at home, we have nothing left. Never mind. There was nothing more to say. Eisenhower walks over to the Closenberg Rebbe and he says, Holy Rabbi, tell me, what can I do for you? What can I do for your people? And the Rebbe looked him in the eye. Who knows what the Rebbe is going to ask for? He says, today's Yom Kippur, the holiest day of the year. 4 days from now is Sukkot. We need Daled Minim. We need the 4 species. We need the 4 species. You think you could get us an etrog, a lulav, hadassim, aravot. Sure enough, Eisenhower did not believe his ears. On that day, he dispatched a plane to go to Italy to bring back the Daled Minim for the survivors, and I'm going to come back to where those Daled Minim ended up. But friends, to give over a message, to give over the feelings of the Jewish people, the agony of their suffering, the triumph of our survival, we needed someone as great as the Closenberg Rebbe to teach this to Eisenhower. How great do we have to be to give over the message to future generations of the grandeur of the eternity of the Jewish people and the agonizing suffering of our galus? How great must we be in order to accomplish such a monumental task? You know, a recent Gallup poll revealed the following. They did a study in the United States of America. And the question was, what do you believe most defines being Jewish? Okay? They asked American Jewry, how would you define being a Jew? What is the most important characteristic of being Jewish today? The answer that topped the list at 73% was remembering the Holocaust. Now, well, at first glance, this is a very heartening response. That means American Jewry instinctively understands the importance of Holocaust memorial. However, upon further analysis, this is a statistic that is downright devastating and depressing, because even though 73% of American Jewry identified Holocaust memorial as the most important characteristic of being Jewish, only 19% defined being Jewish as observing the law, which puts into sharp focus the lack of awareness of why we need to remember the Holocaust. Why is it important to us? What do we need to take out of it? Because while 73% of American Jewry acknowledges that Holocaust memorial is vital to our continuity, 73% is also approximately the intermarriage rate in the United States of America. And I want to tell you something. I'm going to tell you a story that I heard firsthand. You're not going to hear this anywhere else. This is a story that my own grandfather, that I'm going to speak about, heard with his own ears from the Nazis. My grandfather, Harav Mordechai Leib Glatstein, who is someone who is very dear to me, very beloved to me, my father's father. He was a rabbi in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. You know where Pennsylvania is one of the states. He was a rabbi for over 70 years, but he was a Holocaust survivor. He survived all the darkest places, Auschwitz, Dachau, Radom. He survived the death camps, the concentration camps, the crematoria. My grandfather, when he was in Auschwitz, he would say Tehillim, and the Nazi would come, clobber him over the head. You know what? Rabbi Shammah knows, even though I'm here only one day, but I have such a connection to the Jews of Brazil, I'm going to tell you some good stories that I don't usually say. One Pesach night, when my grandfather was already well into his 90s, we invited him to our house. I grew up in Flatbush, and we come into the shul Pesach night, and into the shul comes another survivor from Auschwitz, who my grandfather was together with in the death camps, Meir Lachman, Zecher Tzaddik Livracha. And Meir Lachman comes into the shul, and he sees my grandfather, and he sees me, and he says, you know, your grandfather, he really knew how to daven. I'm thinking, yeah, shkayach. Of course he knew how to daven. What do you mean he knows how to daven? He said, no, you don't know what I mean that he knows how to pray. I was with him in the death camps. He would say the Tehillim. The Nazi would clobber him over the head. He would fall in a pool of blood. And 24 hours later, he would get up and continue in the Tehillim right where he was up to. That's what I mean, he knows how to daven. My grandfather said when the Nazi would beat him, he would say, Rabbi, what are you praying for? You think the Jewish people have continuity? You think they're an eternal people? We Nazis, we Germans, we will eradicate all the Jews of Europe. The Jews of Palestine, the Arabs will annihilate the Jews of Palestine. By the way, many people don't know this, but the Mufti from Jerusalem was invited to Auschwitz by Eichmann to enjoy the torture of Jews. My grandfather saw with his own eyes Eichmann and the Mufti, arm in arm, they would walk Jews in front of them, they would beat them, and that was their entertainment. So the Arabs and the Nazis were in cahoots. By the way, I'll speak about this at the end of the talk. Rommel and the German forces were days away from Jerusalem. It was a matter of time. They were going to blitzkrieg through the land of Israel. In a few days, they had already had vans set up to gas all the residents of Eretz Yisrael. The Arabs were broadcasting on the radio, Jews, the Germans are coming. We're going to murder your children. We're going to abuse your wives. They started sending messages, Hail Hitler. The Yishuv in Eretz Yisrael, they thought they were doomed. So we, Nazis, we will destroy the Jews of Europe. The Arabs will destroy the Jews of Palestine. And the Jews in America? The Jews of America will destroy themselves. This is what the Nazis understood, that the Jews of America will assimilate. Unfortunately, Hitler tried to eradicate the Jews of Europe. He did a half-decent job. The facts that he was most correct about was what would happen with American Jewry. Because more Jews have gone lost in the United States of America through spiritual assimilation, through the spiritual Holocaust, than that were killed in Europe. In any event, this evening, I want to tell you about some of the experiences of my saintly grandfather, Rabbi Rabbi Glatstein, who was a survivor of all the dark places. And at the end of the war in 1945, the Germans had to make a very important strategic decision. They were losing the war. They could have either allocated all of their resources to the war front to try to win the war, or they could allocate all of their energy to eradicate all the Jews who were left in Europe, my grandfather included. And they chose the latter. So at the expense of winning the war, they chose to kill more Jews. So they rounded up whatever Jews were still left in the camps, my grandfather included, and they packed them like animals onto cattle cars, where they were headed to the Tyrol Mountains to dig their own graves. I discovered a book. This book describes the conditions in the cattle car. And this book contained a historic treasure that my family was not aware of. The name of the book is A Brush with Death by Morris Wisegrad. He writes, there are more than 100 men stuffed into our car. It was so crowded, no one could sit. The doors were shut immediately when the car was full. It took about 3 hours until the train started moving again. Finally, the train began to move, and it stopped at the Gdansky terminal. It stood here for an hour and a half. Could you imagine? You have 100 Jews packed like sardines onto the cattle car for 4.5 hours. The heat became unbearable. We started screaming through the windows, begging for water. The Ukrainian guard said, okay, we'll give you water in exchange for valuables. So people started taking off their watches, pulling out gold teeth, and very often they would give the Ukrainian guards their valuables, and the guard would just spill the water on their face. After many, many hours in the blazing heat, people had to perform bodily functions in the car. The stench became unbearable. People lost all sensibilities. Death was imminent. This author writes, there was one rabbi in the car. Rabbi Mordechai Glatstein was in our car. At midnight, Rabbi Glatstein called out, Yidden, say vidoy. They all thought their end was near. They said vidoy. They said Shema Yisrael. And the chapter ends off, Rabbi Glatstein and his brother miraculously survived the war. How did they survive? With the help of the American Army. The American Army discovered the plan, and under the direction of Brigadier General Henning Linden, they bombed the railroad track, thwarting the plan of these Rishayim. My grandfather said many times, with the SS officers, when they realized that the American Army was approaching, they took off their army uniform, they put it on the survivors, and they took the prisoners' uniforms, and the Germans put on their uniforms so that the American soldiers shouldn't catch them. But when the American Army landed, they were not duped by the scheme, because the German soldiers were fat pigs, and the survivors were walking skeletons, they were living cadavers. And the American general handed my grandfather his pistol. He handed him his gun. He said, Rabbi, here's the gun. Take revenge. Take revenge. And my grandfather said, revenge? I leave revenge to the Almighty. It's been 5 years since I've been able to learn my Gemara. I'm in the middle of Masechta Baba Basra, Tractate Baba Basra. That is my freedom. That is all that I need. I leave revenge to the Almighty. And I'm very proud to tell you that my grandfather, besides being a great Torah scholar, he also had studied English before the war. So when he was liberated, the American Army made him the head of the religious department of the Joint Distribution Committee. And in that capacity, my grandfather had an army uniform and a jeep, and he was able to ship in to the survivors Tashmishe Mitzvah, Tashmishe Kedusha, Talesim, Tfillin. He built mikvahs in the DP camp. He built yeshivas in the DP camp. And he was the one who served as Eisenhower's translator to the survivors and as the Closenberg Rebbe's translator to Eisenhower. So when Eisenhower shipped in the Daled Minim, they came to the desk of my grandfather. And my grandfather was the one who distributed the Daled Minim to the survivors on the very first Sukkot after the Holocaust. And I'm not just telling you a story, I can show you the photographs of my grandfather handing out the Daled Minim to these survivors. I want to take you back 80 years ago to 1942. And there's a young boy who's 5 years old, and he stretches out his neck to get a glimpse of his father. His father was the Rav of Pietrikov. And his father is standing at the Umschlagplatz. The Umschlagplatz was the center square for deportation. Rav Moshe Chaim Lao was the chief rabbi of Pietrikov. And his little boy, Yisrael Meir, catches a glimpse of his father. His father had an impressive black beard, a regal kapota, and he's surrounded by the residents of the city of Pietrikov, 28,000 Jews in Pietrikov. By the way, Rav Moshe Chaim Lao was deported to Treblinka. The Nazis ordered all the Jews of the city to shave off their beard and payas. And many people came to the rabbi and say, Rabbi, are we allowed to do that? Could we shave off our beard? Could we shave off our payas? And the rabbi said, not only can you, you're obligated to. V'chai bahem, you're not to risk your life just to perform a mitzvah or a minhag. You're obligated to. But he himself did not shave off his beard. because he wanted to maintain the tradition, and more importantly, he believed the honor of the rabbi is the honor of the kehillah. And this was a matter of kavod tzibur. And this young boy, Yisrael Meir Lao, he sees the Nazi take the mica, the club, and he kicked the father with his nailed boots, and he unleashed vicious dogs against the rabbi, against his father. And he then took the mica and with all his strength hit the rabbi across the back. And little Yisrael Meir Lao sees his father is about to lose his footing, and with supernatural spiritual strength, he braces himself to stand tall so that the Germans would not demean the honor and the dignity of the Rabbanos and the representatives of Torah. The women and the children were separated from the men. So Yisrael Meir Lao's mother and two brothers. So it was Yisrael Meir, his brother Shmulik, and his mother are in the shul, the great synagogue of Pietrkov. And there they have to witness inhuman scenes. So the whole shul is packed to the gills, like with the women and the children. And the guard is sitting down, is standing on the podium, and he sees up in the balcony, there's an old woman, an 80-year-old woman, and she's holding on to the railing. And she flashes her diamond ring, and the soldier shouts, "Davai, Davai, give it to me, give it to me!" She's shaken. Well, what am I supposed to do? She doesn't budge. The officer makes a mad dash up to the balcony, attacks the woman like a tiger, slams her down on the floor, and rips the ring off her finger. That was the atmosphere in the great synagogue of Pietrkov on that fateful evening. Suddenly, in the middle of the night, the doors swing open, and two SS officers are standing there at the door with lanterns in their hand, and they start reading off a list, and they say, anyone whose name is on this list, walk out. And everybody knew what that meant. Everybody knew whoever remained in the shul, their fate was sealed. They were going to be sent off to the camps. And this was a brief reprieve for anybody whose name was being called. The first name that was read, Lao Chaya. Okay, so Yisrael Meir's mother hears her name first, and she doesn't move, she doesn't budge. And the reason she doesn't budge is she's waiting to hear the names of her two little boys, because she's not leaving without them. But the Germans just continue saying names, and the names of these boys are not read. And all of a sudden the Germans announce, there's one person whose name was called who didn't walk out of the room. And Chaya Lao, her motherly instinct aroused, realizes she only has one choice. She, without saying any words, motions to her two boys that she's going to have to leave the room, and they're going to have to somehow slip out under her coat. So they make the impossible attempt. The Nazis are stuffing the space of the door only to allow one person at a time. Yisrael Meir is in the front of his mother's coat. Shmulik is in the back of the mother's coat. They have to do this without moving, without making any noise. Yisrael Meir slips through. His mother slips through. And all of a sudden, the Nazi detected a little bit too much movement. And he slams his hand down, separating Shmulik from the mother and brother. Hours later, Shmulik was sent to Treblinka. They never saw him again. I'm sure you all have heard the name Yisrael Meir Lao, who would later go on to survive, become the rabbi of Tel Aviv, and ultimately the chief rabbi of the state of Israel. And Rabbi Lao writes, the question that plagues and haunts him every day of his life, the question that motivates and inspires him, is why was his brother Milik torn away from his mother and he was saved and he was spared? Not why did God let that happen, but what does God want from me? If God spared me, what am I supposed to do with my life? What does Hashem want from me? And this is the most important question any intelligent, thinking Jew ought to ask themselves every single day of their life. We've been through a long road, friends, starting with the destruction of the first temple, where the death toll was enormous. The second Beis Hamikdash, Josephus writes, the death toll was 1.1 million. To 1391, when hundreds of thousands of Jews were forcibly baptized. 1492, where hundreds of thousands of Jews again were expelled. Crusades, pogroms, gas chamber, Holocaust, October 7th. If we're still around, if we're still alive and kicking, the most important question that we need to ask of ourselves is, what does God want from us? What is our responsibility in this world if we are still around? I want to share with you a very interesting question. Remember Moshe Rabbeinu? Moses? Did you ever realize that this is a very unusual name? Moshe? Moshe is a very unusual name. Where did Moshe get this name from? When Moshe Rabbeinu was born, and he had his Brit Milah, and they said, V'yikarei Shemo b'Yisrael, guess what they didn't say? They didn't say Moshe. The Medrash said he has many names. Avigdar, Yekusiel, Yehonasan. But Moshe is not one of them. Moshe is the name that the daughter of the Pharaoh gave him, because she plucked him out of the river, and she said, Ki min hamayim ishisihu. Why do we continue to call him by the name Moshe? That's not his name. That's not a Jewish name. That's like calling a rabbi Jeffrey, Stephen, Kevin. He has Jewish names. Why won't we call him his Jewish name? Why call him the name the daughter of the Pharaoh called him? You know, Moshe Rabbeinu, he's working for his father-in-law, like a good Jewish son-in-law. And he's walking in the desert, and all of a sudden, he sees something very unusual. He sees a bush, and the bush is burning. And you know, the rabbis tell us that this bush has been burning for a very, very long time. And people used to walk by and say, oh, that's a bush, that's interesting. And they would continue on their way. Nobody stopped. People said, look, the markets are still open, the stores are still open, it's tax season. Nobody stopped and asked, what's going on over here? They just took it for granted. But Moshe Rabbeinu says, Asurana ve'ereh, hamareh hagadol hazeh, madua lo yivar hasneh. Moshe Rabbeinu says, what's going on over here? Why is it not burning? Let me turn aside for a minute. I'll close the store, I'll ignore the market, I'll ignore my soccer team, and let me find out what's going on. Why is the bush not burning? Ooh, and the Almighty says, that's the man I've been waiting for. I've been waiting a long time for someone to ask that question. Why is the bush not burning? What does God say? Vayikra loi mitoich hasneh. The Almighty calls to Moshe from the sneh. What does he say? Moshe, Moshe. Not Yekusiel, not Avigdar, not Yehonasan, not any Jewish name. He picked his Gentile Egyptian name, Moshe. Why? So I have a good friend who's a grandson of Rabbi Beryl Wein. His name is Ezra Gwertz. He gave me a recording of Rabbi Wein speaking at a family event. I've later heard Rabbi Wein say this numerous times, about a trip that he made when he visited Yad Vashem. Rabbi Wein liked to go to Holocaust memorials, and Yad Vashem, of course, is a tribute to the 6 million Jews who were destroyed in World War II. And he got word that there was a new exhibit in Yad Vashem. They had a memorial for the 1.5 million Jewish children who were killed in the Holocaust. Do you know how many 1.5 million is? How many people could fill up this august auditorium. 700 people? So just imagine, I don't know, 5,000 to 10,000 other rooms like this. That's how many 1.5 million is. We're talking not 1,000 times more, we're talking more like 10,000 times more. So there's a Jew in Beverly Hills called Spiegel. He's sent to Auschwitz with his wife and 5-year-old son. About a year later, he walks out without a wife, without a child. He comes to California. He's an extremely successful business entrepreneur. He makes it big. He has real estate. He has retail establishments. He wants to make a memorial for his 5-year-old son, but not only his 5-year-old son, but for all 1.5 million Jewish children who were killed in the Holocaust. So he gave $4.5 million to Yad Vashem. He says, make a memorial for my child and all the children. And since then, he's given more than another $10 million to enhance it, to endow it, and so forth. And Rabbi Wein writes, he went to the memorial, and he had his preconceived notion of what a Holocaust memorial is supposed to look like. Probably there'll be pictures and diagrams and statistics and books. And he says he was completely unprepared for what he was about to see. You go into a room about 8 to 10 stories tall. We're talking about a room 6 times the size of this room. And the room is pitch black. It's so black, you can't even put one foot in front of another foot. It's palpably black. You could feel the darkness. V'yamesh chayshach. And after a moment, and your eyes begin to adjust, you see, in the middle of this immense room of darkness, there's one candle that's lit. And by the genius of the designer and the architect of this museum, by reflections through mirrors, this one candle becomes 1.5 million pinpoints of light in the all-pervading darkness. And there's a voice over it. There's a tape that plays. Have you been there? Have you heard it? Hillel Cohen, 3 years old, Vilna. Miriam Goldberg, 7 years old, Sarajevo. Names, 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 till you can't bear it anymore and you want to run out and bury yourself. And Rabbi Wein said that when he left the room, he had a thought that remains with him. I didn't hear my name. My name's not on that list. I'm of the same age. And Rabbi Wein said, I said to myself, if my name's not on the list, then I could still do something in this world. If I could take another boy into the yeshiva, I'm going to do it. If I could study another Blat Gemara, I'm going to do it. If I could do another mitzvah, I'm going to do it. If I could help out another friend, I'm not going to stop. If my name is not on that list. And then Rabbi Wein said, now I understand why the Almighty called out to Moshe, Moshe, Moshe. You know what God was telling Moshe Rabbeinu? What happened to all the other Jewish children who were floating in the Nile? They were all consumed by the snake and the crocodile. You could have been eaten like all the other thousands and thousands of Jewish children. But I saved you. I saved you. I plucked you out. While everyone else was exterminated. Moshe, Moshe. And Moshe has no choice but to say, you got me. Hineni, here I am. I have no choice. If I'm still around and kicking, what could I do for you, God? None of that Moshe couldn't say, ask somebody else, ask Aaron, ask my first cousin, I'll do it tomorrow. No, God says, Moshe, Moshe, I yanked you out of the water. And this is something we can never forget. If you're still around in 2024 and you have a Jewish family and you have the privilege of a Jewish education, after all 2,000 years, we need to hear the call of God, Moshe, Moshe! And we have no choice but to say, okay, God, what can I do for you if I'm still around, if I'm still here? I want to share with you a very personal story. My grandfather, Zecher Tzaddik L'Bracha, was taken from Radom to Dachau. Dachau was the valley of weeping of the Germans' angel of death. Killings every day. Total humiliation in the eyes of the Germans. And my grandfather and his brother was Uncle Henoch. I'm going to tell you an amazing story. It is unscripted. You know, when my grandfather was in Radom, he smuggled in a pair of tefillin. He would wake at the crack of dawn to put on the tefillin every single day. First, my grandfather, and then my grandfather's brother. If you're caught wearing tefillin in Radom, there was a particular Lagerführer named Ficus. If Ficus catches a Jew putting on tefillin, puts a bullet in your head on the spot. Every morning my grandfather would arise early to put on the tefillin, him and his brother. One particular morning, my grandfather put on the tefillin shel yad, and then he put on the tefillin shel rosh. He gave it to his brother Henoch. Henoch puts on the tefillin shel yad. He's in the middle of putting on the tefillin shel rosh. Just then, Ficus walks in. He picks up the gun to shoot. But when he saw the tefillin shel rosh on the head of this Jew, he shook in utter fear. He put the gun down and he ran out trembling. My grandfather said that he witnessed an open miracle. That is what the Gemara says, V'ra'u kol amei haaretz, when the nations of the world see, Ki shem Hashem nikra alecha, that the name of God is upon you, V'yaru mimeka, they will fear you, Elu tefillin shabarosh, these are the tefillin of the head. My grandfather was then taken to Dachau. He was on the line going to the crematoria. He was literally inches from the crematoria. The fire was so choking and hot that his brother turns to him and says, Martcha, please, I need some water. I'm going to die of thirst even before we get in. And my grandfather says, no, we can't. We're not permitted to drink now. Then it will prolong our death. They were both pushed into the crematoria when at the last moment an SS officer came out of nowhere, pulled both of them by their hair. He said, no, you don't belong in here. You're young. You could work. And he pulled them out. My grandfather wrote, this godly wonder will remain in our memories forever. But a very simple thought occurred to me. Because it wasn't only my grandfather that Hashem pulled out of the crematoria. Because if God had not saved my grandfather, I wouldn't be here today. So God saved my grandfather. He saved my father. He saved me. He saved my children who came all the way from New York to Brazil. He saved all of us. I don't know. I guess the Ribbon Hashem wanted us. I guess God wanted us. And you know what, friends? If you're here today and your ancestors were saved from Egypt and from the destruction of the first temple and the destruction of the second temple and the Crusades and the Inquisition and the pogroms and the Holocaust, then God wants you. God wants you. You know, there's an astounding observation of Rabbi Yaakov Emden. Rabbi Yaakov Emden ponders, he contemplates the miracle of Jewish eternity. He says 80% of our people perished in Egypt, but your direct ancestors were saved, so you could be here tonight to hear Divrei Torah, to be able to pray, to be able to daven, to be able to learn Torah. Your ancestors were saved from the destruction of the first temple, the destruction of the second temple. Thousands were destroyed in the times of the Crusades. Spanish Inquisition. God saved your ancestors from the Holocaust. For a Jew to be here tonight, it's not statistically unlikely. It's not highly improbable. It's downright impossible. It's a miracle of the greatest proportion. Rav Yaakov Emden wrote a commentary to the Siddur. In his commentary to the Siddur, Rav Yaakov Emden writes, I will read in Hebrew and I'll translate. Ve'ech lo yevosh hakofer b'hashgacha v'ya'amod nechlam. How can the disbeliever, the heretic, not be ashamed? Misha ya'ayin b'yichud inyanenu ma'amadenu ba'olam. Anyone who studies the eternity of the Jewish people. Anachnu ha'umah hagolah sepizura. We, the exiled nation, the scattered sheep. Achar kol ma she'avar aleinu. After everything we've endured. Mehatzarot v'hatmurot alafim me'ashanim. After 2,000 years. Says Rabbi Yaakov Emden, Chai nafshi. I swear. I take an oath. When I contemplate this miracle, Gadloi etzli yoter, it is greater to me. Mikol nisim v'niflaot sha'asa Hashem yitbarach la'avotenu b'mitzrayim. Than all the miracles that God did for our ancestors in Egypt. You ever hear somebody say, if only I would see an open miracle like the splitting of the sea, then I would really believe in God. The Jews who crossed the sea, you know what they said? This is not a real miracle. If only I would see a real miracle like a Jew in 2024, then I would believe in God. You want to see a miracle? Look at the face of a Jew in 2024. It's the greatest miracle you'll ever see in the history of the world. And who did God do that miracle for? For you. Because He wants you. He wants your tefillah. He wants your mitzvot. He wants your limud Torah. He wants your chesed and all of your good deeds. Because He loves you. I'm afraid to say it, but I can't withhold good from such good people. In Nusach Ashkenaz, we say before Kriyat Shema, not ahavat olam ahavtanu, ahava rabba. You know what the word rabba means? It doesn't mean great. It means expanding. That as much as God loved our great-great-grandparents, as the generations pass, His love for us is even greater. God's love for the Jewish people expands by the generation, by the time, by the year. 1946. Rabbi Berelwein again, he's a young boy. He's 11 years old. And this is in the immediate aftermath of the Holocaust. And his father says, Berel, a great rabbi is coming to town, to Chicago. Who's that? Rabbi Isaac Halevi Herzog, the chief rabbi of Palestine. He's coming, and all the distinguished rabbis of the Midwest of Chicago are coming out to greet him. All the yeshiva students are coming out to greet him. And Rabbi Herzog was a very aristocratic personality. He wore a shiny top hat, he had a cane, he had a silver Tanakh, and he comes off the plane, and he's headed to the Skokie Yeshiva. And the yeshiva is full to capacity with all the students of the Midwest and all the balabatim of the Midwest. And Rav Herzog gives a 45-minute in-depth Torah talk, a pilpul shiur. And then he says, I want to address the young men in the audience. And Rav Herzog then unrolls a list. And this was a list of the names of 10,000 boys and girls that Jewish families gave over to priests, to monasteries, to Christian families in the Holocaust, hoping to save their children by giving over their children to non-Jewish families. And Rav Herzog had an audience with the Pope, and he says to the Pope, by the way, he's called Pope Pius, Lashon Sagi Nahar, I guess. He's called the righteous Pope. And he says, Pope, I have with me the names of 10,000 boys and girls that Jewish families gave over to your religion. Pope, we're back. We survived. We want our children back. Give us back our children. So the Pope looks at the list. He looks at Rabbi Herzog, and he says, "Dear Rabbi, all of these 10,000 boys and girls were baptized. Our religion states that once a child is baptized, he can never return to his original religion. Thank you, but no thanks. Have a great day." And the door was slammed on Rav Herzog's face. Rav Herzog comes to Chicago, and he turns to the boys in the Chicago yeshiva in 1946. And he says, "I have the list of these 10,000 children. There is nothing I can do for these children. These children are lost forever." And he puts his head down on the lectern, and he begins to weep like a baby. Rabbi Wein says he was never so frightened in his life to see this great rabbi break down crying like a baby. The rabbi then lifts up his head, and his face is beet red like a lion. And he cries out, "There's nothing I could do for these 10,000 children. But you young men, you're still with us. What are you going to do for the future of the Jewish people?" And Rabbi Wein says, this call of Rav Herzog inspires, rings in his ears every day of his life. Whenever he wants to throw in the towel, whenever he feels a little despondent, whenever it feels a little hopeless, he hears the call of Rav Herzog. What will you do for the future of the Jewish people? And all of us who are here tonight, we have to appreciate that you are hand-picked. You are cherry-picked by the Almighty. You're selected to be from the She'eris Yisrael. We say on Monday and Thursday, Shomer Yisrael, Shemar She'erit Yisrael. We are the remnant of all the Jewish nation from all of history. And God handpicked us. He saved us from the Nile, from the crocodiles, from Egypt, from crusades, from Churban Beis HaMikdash, from Holocaust. Because He has a job for you. And you know what that job is? He wants you to call out to Him and say, Ki lishu'atcha kivinu kol hayom. God, bring the redemption for the Jewish people. God Almighty, elevate the honor of the Jewish people. Elevate the honor of the Torah. Elevate your honor. Ki lishu'atcha kivinu kol hayom. V'tachazena einenu b'shuvcha l'tzion b'rachamim. God handpicked you to be the one. He wants your Torah, your mitzvot, your ma'asim tovim, because He wants you to be the one to bring us to the finish line. In the merit of us coming together in this evening and Ezrat Hashem the next couple of days, and the merit of all of Klal Yisrael, we should all be zocheh to bring the Jewish people to its great destiny, to see the coming of the Gula Shlema, the Binyan Beit HaMikdash, B'mheira v'yameinu, Amen v'Amen. Thank you very much.
You've just experienced another Torah class brought to you by TorahAnytime.com.